Great. Okay, thank you. So I think your coordinator might be giving you some information on when you're going to do your CA, and I'll be submitting questions on the topics that we've done. Multiple choice questions, single best answer. I'll try to make them a bit simple and straightforward. So just stick through the handouts and stuff like that. There's 10 questions for each topic. So you might expect a CA very soon from your coordinator. Now today's topic, we're talking about learning and memory, but I want you to concentrate more on memory, because the learning part is more psychology than neurology really, and it might be a bit difficult to memorize and start to understand. But what I would want you to know, I will emphasize, and what I would think is junk for you, don't pay much attention. Yeah, I'm the one setting the exam, so I know what I emphasize and what I didn't emphasize. Okay, yeah, so we'll just go quickly through learning, but we'll concentrate more on memory. Okay, this thing. Okay, great. All right, so learning and memory. So learning is just the ability to alter behavior on the basis of experience. So it's day-to-day kind of scenario, and what you experience, you're able to learn. And then the memory is just the acquisition when you acquire that stimulus, and then you store it, and then you're able to retrieve it. Then that's memory. So it's a sequence of acquisition, storage, and retrieval. And then you have another definition of a thought there. Then memory can be learning, can be differentiated in a number of ways. Reflex learning and incidental learning. And then this is further subdivided into non-associated learning and associated learning. We'll try to be a bit shallow on this. I don't want you to go into too much detail, because you are going to be doctors and not psychologists. So the one that you should pay attention to is more of memory. That won't be your job. Yeah, so this is what I was saying. There's non-associative and associative memory. So remember, why am I mixing things? Learning can be incidental or reflex. So the reflex learning is the type of learning that is mostly associated with the innate ability that you have. You know, when a baby is born and the mother puts a breast on the baby is able to suck. So it's part of an innate thing that needs a stimulus. Then incidental learning is the learning one. It's like unintended learning, just like the word says, incidental learning is unintended learning. And then both of these, incidental learning and reflex learning, reflex learning can be subdivided into different types of learning, which is associated learning and the non-associated learning. So that's the non-associative learning and associative learning. The non-associative learning involves only one stimulus with repeated exposure. We're going to see some examples of this. That's when you can understand it better. And then non-associative learning, types of non-associative learning. So for you here, what I would emphasize is that you know the two types of learning, as in the reflex learning and the incidental learning. And then on reflex learning, there are again two types, subdivided into two types, non-associative and associative learning as parts of reflex learning. And for the non-associative type of reflex learning, you have the habituation or sensitization. So habituation is when you have a decrease in a response to a stimulus. Say someone is tickling you, maybe when you are not aware, and someone comes to tickle you, you might have a normal stimulus, but when that stimulus continues, you might not be responding to it um, as severe, as you were before. So it decreases in terms of the response, according to that, as long as you're having that repeated stimulus. That's essentially what habituation entails. Also, another example would be if someone is scaring you, maybe you see a German Shepherd first, and then you obviously are scared, and then the next time you come to that place, obviously the same German Shepherd, if you saw how it reacted to you the first time, you might not react the way you reacted the first time. So your response to that same stimulus is going to be diminished. So then the opposite of that is sensitization. So this is an example of what I was saying for habituation. Also, you look at that graphic picture of the watch in the living room. It's Mambwe. Could you kindly, is it Mambwe? You kindly mute yourself. You can't miss it. So you when you see it first, you are used to it.
50-50. Ali wote ekiki bakose ba PF
Come forward.
Okay,
thank you. Sorry about that. All right. So you can see this watch, like you can't miss it. But the more time you spend in this same living room, you stop paying extra attention to it. But the first time you enter there, you won't miss it. Okay. The response you have in terms of the innate response you have to it, the first time you see it, you'll not miss it. By the time you spend more time in the living room, it will just become like a normal thing. So that's essentially what habituation means. Okay, and then we have physiological response as to how habituation happens. You can read through that. I won't pay much attention to it. The same thing as explaining about sensitization, which is the opposite of habituation. And then also something you shouldn't pay attention to, but you can read through. It's just a cellular basis of sensitization as well. I'm just trying to cruise through so that we go and discuss on memory. So this is also associative learning. Remember, we said there's non-associative learning and associative learning. And associative learning non-associative was divided into habituation and sensitization, but this one is now divided into classical conditioning and operant conditioning. I think you guys should have done psychology and you did the Pavlov stimulation, the classical conditioning, blah, 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 blah. That's psychology. That's what I'm saying. You're not going to pay attention to it now. All you have to know here are the divisions of associative learning, which is classical conditioning, operant conditions. The rest of the details you can read through. Don't say he didn't tell us to read, and then if it's brought, then you fail. But chances are almost zero that I'll bring something in that much detail. Okay, so I vary to time, but I think I'm gonna try to cruise. So I want to discuss more about memory. Yeah, so classical condition, it's like you did in psychology. It's about two stimuli that are non-related. Okay, one that invokes a response and one that doesn't invoke a response. So like that example we have there, we have that bell. When it rings, the dog doesn't respond to it because it's not conditioned. And then the other one is food. That's an innate response that the dog is gonna have. Now, when you marry these two, one which doesn't stimulate a response naturally and one which stimulates a response, you marry the two. So when the person who has a pet wants to give the pet food, rings a bell. So now what will happen is that whenever a bell rings, the pet will think that there's food. So that's what happens. That's classical condition. It's part of learning. I know you did this in your psychology. Again, we've explained this already. Blah, 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 blah. Operant conditioning, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to go to memory. Yeah, I'm going to talk about memory. So memory, now this is where you need to pay a bit more attention. So memory is just the acquisition, like we said, acquisition. So it's a sequence you acquire the information and the ability to store the information, and then also the ability to retrieve the information. Now that creates your memory. Then memory can be divided in a number of ways: how you acquire the memory, or the duration of the memory. Okay, so the duration of the memory could be short term, intermediate, and long term. And then how you acquire the memory could be explicit or implicit. So the physiological basis on how the information was acquired or stored or recorded, there's implicit memory and explicit memory. Implicit memory, you don't need to be conscious. Just you do it unconscious. You do things unconsciously. But explicit memory, you need to be conscious for you to be able to recall and do those things. That's what it means. But we'll look at the details further to make it a bit more simpler. And then depending on, sorry, let me remove these. Okay, let's do that. Yeah, and then depending upon the permanence of storage, meaning the duration, could be short-term, intermediate, long-term, and intermediate and long-term. So short-term is essentially just seconds. Now, short-term is, for some, they would say even up to like 18, 20 seconds. So this information is not really stored for a long time. It can easily go. But then the other mistake is one would think the difference between short-term and working memory. Short-term is a part of working memory. So working memory is more like short-term information that you get that you need to use for your response. I don't know how I can put it in a good explanation. For you to provoke a stimuli or manipulate a response, you need a short-term memory, and that memory that you have now becomes working memory. Now, the long-term, so I'll go short-term memory is about seconds, and long-term memory is indefinite. So in between short-term and long-term memory becomes intermediate memory. Now, intermediate memory can become long-term memory when it becomes indefinitely stored in the body. Like you remember it anyhow. Okay, that becomes long-term memory. So long-term memory, again, you can have explicit long-term memory, you can have implicit long-term memory. So explicit memory, like we said, you need to be conscious for you to recall it. Well, the implicit memory, you don't need to be conscious to do it. And then the further division is that there's semantic memory, which is memory about general facts, facts and general knowledge. Who is the president of Bolivia? Who is the president of South Africa? Where the Himalayas? Where's Japan on the map? So those are facts and general knowledge. Those are part of the long-term memory, and they are called semantic memory. They are to do with facts and general knowledge. And then so for you to be able to remember that Bolivia is in South America, you should be conscious, because if you're not conscious, you can't remember that. An unconscious person can't remember that. So that's why it's called conscious recall. Again, episodic memory, which is to do with personal experienced events, like when you had your engagement, or when somebody first proposed to you, when your father died, when your mother went to UK, and things like that. So personal experiences, that's episodic memory. Again, to remember those events, you need to be conscious, because if you're not conscious, you can't remember it. So they still fall under the part of explicit memory. Now, implicit memory as part of long-term can be further divided into procedural memory, which is more motor and cognitive functions. So you don't need to be you don't need to think about it. By without conscious, it means thinking about it. When you get into a car, when you learn how to drive, you don't have to think about it. Like, okay, now it just becomes like a reflex as a procedure. If you learn how to ride a bike, okay, bicycle, you don't have to think about it. You just get on the bicycle and start cycling, and you start off. Okay, so you don't have to literally think like, oh, how should I ride the bike now? How should it just happens like a reflex. It's called procedural memory. So you can be away from that activity for years and years and years, 20 years, but when someone gives you a bicycle, you'll be able to ride it. So it's stored in the long-term memory. And okay, thank you. It's stored in the long-term memory, and you don't have to literally think about it. And then the priming is just enhanced identification of weights and objects. You don't need to be able to think about it. You just have that ability to do that. Then types of memory, like we said implicit memory and explicit memory. I've explained already. The only thing probably I didn't explain is about its involvement with the hippocampus. So implicit memory is not associated with awareness and does not involve processing in the hippocampus. Okay, well, explicit memory is associated with awareness and involves processing in the hippocampus. So that's important messages that you need to know. Its relation with the hippocampus, not the parahippocampus, but hippocampus. Okay. This is what I was explaining, how to perform something depends on conscious processes, including motor skills, but you don't have to think about it consciously. So it's procedural memory. Your brain already knows about it. So it's unconscious and automatic. Okay, so it does not depend on conscious processes. That's the implicit memory. When we talk about procedural memory, I've explained that already. And then this is a very important one. It shows you the parts of the brain that are involved in the different types of memory that you have. Also to do with learning. So procedural memory, that is skills and habits, how to play guitar, violin, how to ride a bicycle. You need your basal ganglia as part of it because it's motor. And then implicit memory, like classical conditioning, for the use of your skeletal musculature, you need your cerebellum. And then for the emotional responses, the limbic system, and in this situation, we're talking about the amygdala, which is involved in the emotional response. And then priming, we have neocortex. So these ones you need to know where the different parts are in terms of the brain. This is the doctor stuff and not the psychologist stuff. So this is what you need to know. That's what I was emphasizing. I think we've already talked about this one. So the explicit memory to do with factual knowledge of people, places, and things. So which could be semantic memory or episodic memory. For this one, you need to be aware. And because you need to be aware, it will involve the hippocampus as part of the brain parts that will be involved in your storing that memory. Will be the hippocampus as one of them. And then you also need to use your temporal lobe as part of the brain that is needed for the same. So I've talked about semantic memory, episodic memory already. Semantic memory, storage of semantic memory. Yeah. So for you to store semantic memory, let me see, where was that? Okay. So for you to gain facts of general knowledge, obviously you need visual memory, auditory memory, and somatosensory memory. So auditory memory, when someone tells you Brazil is in South America, or when you know that green is green, you need your visual memory because, if you're blind, you won't know what green is. But when you see it using your visual memory, you know when you see a color like green is green, and when you see red, you know red is red. So those are the parts that are needed for you to store semantic memory. And then the types of memory, I think we've talked about these, but this is just a flowchart that would help you remember which parts of the brain is responsible for what. So we have the explicit memory there on top and the implicit memory down. And then remember we said we have semantic memory and episodic memory, which are parts of the explicit memory and the semantic memory. Apart from the issues we talked about, the hippocampus, we also have the prefrontal gyrus and the anterior temporal cortex as part of the brain that is involved in semantic memory. And then we have the episodic memory, which is also as a response to the parts of the brain involving the temporal lobe, neocortex, and the hippocampus. Okay, and then down there we have the implicit memory, otherwise called as the non-declarative memory. And then we have the different parts that we've discussed there, and the related brain parts that are involved, like the amygdala, the neocortex, the striatum, the cerebellum, the motor cortex. Is it too much to ask you guys to name where each of these is found, or it's something you can do.
Too
Too
much.
much. Too much.
I don't think so, because I've almost like cut off half of the topic for you. So remember I said for learning, you just concentrate on almost like the subdivisions, not really the semantics of that. And then you concentrate more of memory, because I didn't really want you to concentrate so much on things that you might not really need later in your life, but to concentrate more on things you need. You need more of checking the memory of the patient than checking if they can learn, because that's not your job. That will be a job for somebody else. But for you, you need the memory part. So that's why I figured we didn't really need to spend a lot of time on that, but a lot of time on the memory. I think you need to know this. I'm sorry, guys, but I think you need to know this chart. Just spend a bit of time, learn this chart. We'll see. If we think it's not, it's too much, I'll discuss with your 4 class reps, and I always give feedback. Think through, read through it, see if you're able to memorize it, and give feedback through your class reps, and then we can make a decision. Okay. Then damage to, okay. So damage to the cortical areas and loss of specific information. So now we're talking about what will happen when someone has damage to some parts of the brain, and how it affects their learning and how it affects their memory. So someone can have what is called associative visual agnosia. Remember those, was it the other time when we we're talking about finger agnosia, when someone has, where they can't differentiate the finger types, whether it's index finger, ring finger, when we're discussing about language the other time on Sunday, where we talked about injury to the angular gyrus, and then someone can't differentiate which one is an index finger, which one is a thumb, and stuff like that. Now this time, when someone has damage to the parietal cortex, they will have visual agnosia, associative. So they can identify something, but they cannot write the name of the object. They can identify it. Okay, when you tell them to identify what, they can identify it, but the same person, you tell them, can you write the name of the objects that are there? They can't write the names. Okay, yo, it's closing in 10 minutes. Okay, so then the other one is called appreciative visual agnosia. For this one, it's mostly to do with the posterior occipital lobe damage. They can name the objects, but cannot draw the objects. So they can name, identify the objects, but when you ask them to draw an object which they were able to draw before they got injured, or before they got a lesion around that area, they cannot be able to draw it. Okay, yeah, so that's one of the things that someone might have. Okay. Next. So when there's damage to the neocortex or prefrontal cortex, you get amnesia. Amnesia is you can't remember things, you can't remember events. All right. And then the next one, the short term, long term, I've talked about this. And for you to have long-term memory, you need to encode the information, consolidate the information, and store it. So it comes in, you consolidate it, okay? And the once you consolidate it, then it becomes stored as long-term memory. Okay, it's the working memory, which I already explained. Intermediate memory, which I also touched on, nothing much different. And we've already talked about the differences in the different parts of long-term memory. Mechanism of long-term memory, I've already said that you have to encode. After encoding, you consolidate, and after consolidating, you store. Then how you consolidate, the number of different ways on how information can be consolidated. Number one is the expression of specific genes, which you don't need to know. There'll be synthesis of new proteins, which you don't need to know. And then there are structural changes, which you don't need to know. Okay. Then the coding parts and the parts that are involved in coding, which you need to know. would be the hippocampus, thalamus, prefrontal cortex, amygdala, and the neocortex. So which parts of the brain are involved in codifying long-term memory? The answer is there. The question is simple. Hippocampus, thalamus, prefrontal cortex, amygdala, neocortex. I think this is one presentation that may be difficult for you, but just try to spend a bit of time, not so much on the first part, but this second part. Retrieval of memory, nothing much there. Then applied aspects like drugs that can facilitate and increase your ability to learn and memory. So common CNS stimulants like narcotics, people that use drugs, those narcotics, heroin, morphine, what is this? These drugs they abuse, codeine, and all these neurostimulants. They actually help you in enhancing your learning and memory. Drugs like caffeine, also another drug which is abused sometimes. Methamphetamine. Now we're talking about amphetamine, and then a number of other drugs like nicotine for people that smoke. Then mechanism of action is that they facilitate consolidation of the information. So the neurostimulants. So now don't start taking caffeine every day and trying to increase your learning and memory. It's going to affect you. So you have to be careful on that one. Then addiction, the same drugs that we're talking about that would increase your memory, they can also cause an addiction because all these produce dopamine on the limbic system, on the nuclear accumbens. So that's one of the ways they would increase your learning and memory. But these are controlled, most of these are controlled drugs. And then you have also alcohol there, probably one of the few advantages sometimes of alcohol. Yeah, but we never said it. Lest all of you start drinking every weekend, a bit of alcohol. So amnesia is just where you loss of recall. You can't remember things. It could be anterograde or retrograde. So antegrade amnesia is just an ability to establish new long-term memories, where retrograde an ability to recall past memories. Okay, so most lesions involve the hippocampus for antegrade, and lesions involve the temporal lobe for retrograde. I think we'll finish. We won't need a second class. So senile dementia is mostly to do in the elderly people, and the commonest causes are Alzheimer's disease, strokes, Parkinson's disease. Hey, who is that one? Okay, business. Okay, thank you. Okay, so senile dementia mostly happens when someone is old, and the commonest disease, especially in the Caucasians, is Alzheimer's disease. And then we also have CVAs, which is a stroke, and Parkinsonism, and prion disease, not so common in our setting, maybe because we don't have the abilities. And so this is Alzheimer's disease, a very common cause of senile dementia. It's just a neurodegenerative disease. Just know those two. And then loss of recent memory, nothing much there. I think we've touched about most of the things. And then the concept of dominant hemisphere is that somehow you always want to know which side someone uses, whether they use the right hand or the left hand. So the concept is that, remember, the side which is dominant is going to have most of these functions that we're talking about, the Wernicke case, the functions of the Wernicke case, angular gyrus, and the frontal motor speech areas. They are more developed in the dominant hemisphere. So that's why we always want to emphasize which hemisphere is dominant. And then 95% of the left hemisphere is dominant for most. So 95%, most people are left hemisphere dominant. So the Wernicke's area in non-dominant is concerned with the emotional content, intonation of spoken language, and a number of other things that we discussed about the previous time. So we won't have to go into much detail about that. Discussed this already. And then the concept of categorical and representational hemisphere. So the functions allotted to the left hemisphere in a right-handed person. So if you have a right-handed person, your dominant part is the left side. So you have a right-hand control. The spoken language will be controlled in the left side. The written language will be controlled on the left side. the mathematical skills, scientific skills, and reasoning. Okay, well, the other one who has functions allotted to right hemisphere in a right-handed person, they'll have left hand control, the music awareness, and art awareness, insight, and imagination. And remember, for the people that actually use the left hand, they still have, for most of them, the speech centers are still on the left side for majority of these people. So it doesn't mean that when you are left-handed, then the speech center is going to be on the right side. No, for majority of them, the speech centers are still going to be on the right side. I think that should be that. So the emphasis today is that don't spend much time on learning, because that's more of psychological, but I want you to spend more time on the memory, and that flow chart, try to know it, which part of the brain controls which type of memory. I think we might ask you on that one. And then the other graph that I said that you should concentrate on would be, let's see, so that you don't spend so much time on useless things. Sorry guys, I'm going spirit, I'm tired. This one. So apart from that flowchart, spend time also to remember these parts that are involved in codifying the long-term memory. Do you have any questions? Judith was asking me about you were asking me about the topics that you covered. I said most of the topics, I don't know, I'll probably have to write something for you. Most of the topics that we covered, I was marrying them into two or three topics in one. Okay. So as far as I was concerned, we're remaining with two topics, which is language and speech, as well as learning and memory, which we finished today. So over the course of the long weekend, I'll be sending multiple choice questions to your course coordinator for all those topics that we covered. So what we did not emphasize on, and I'll send you these handouts, what we did not emphasize and don't really pay much attention unless I communicate to the class rep that you should pay attention on this part. But in the lecture, I used to emphasize that you should pay attention on this, don't pay attention on this. So just follow that, and then everything is good. Okay.